The Japanese captured American Army Air Forces units in the Philippines late on December 8th, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack. General Douglas MacArthur's air assets were essentially eliminated from the campaign by that airstrike, but those that remained valiantly and expertly resisted an overwhelming force until the very end. The Imperial Japanese Army deployed troops on Bataan Island on December 8th after securing air supremacy. On December 10th, more troops arrived in Vigan and Apari. The unprepared and inexperienced Philippine Army forces were unable to cope with the Japanese invasion, and the landings on northern Luzon were met with little resistance. On December 12th, more landings were conducted at Legazpi from the Palau Islands. On December 20th, the Palaus also launched an invasion of the island of Mindanao. On Christmas Eve, Jolo Island was overrun. Christmas Eve saw the primary Japanese landings in the Philippines at the Lingayen Gulf on Luzon, which is situated between San Fernando and San Fabian. These fresh soldiers, 43110 men from the 14th Army, soon pushed the Filipino troops guarding the Gulf beaches away and made touch with those arriving from north of Luzon. Enemy forces were now moving in from the north and south, confronting the American and Philippine forces on Luzon. The former strategy of General MacArthur to protect Luzon at the beaches was no longer feasible. This was promptly recognized, and as early as December 12th, MacArthur had given Philippine President Manuel Quezon advice to be ready to evacuate Manila and relocate the seat of government to Bataan. MacArthur was reluctant to give up his home to the enemy, but he was forced to do so due to the Japanese's continuous advance from both sides and the absence of reliable air or naval help. The decision was taken, and the required orders were issued by December 23rd. WP03 in effect was the directive issued by General MacArthur's headquarters. One of numerous pre-war plans that addressed possible adversaries of the United States in the event of war was War Plan Orange 3. The plans were numbered according to the color assigned to each possible adversary. WP03 dealt with Philippine defense, while the Orange War plans targeted Japan. It was expected that Japan would strike with less than 48 hours' notice and without declaring war. The United States would not have been able to send reinforcements to the Philippines prior to the Japanese attack under such circumstances. Therefore, until the United States could force a route to transfer reinforcements, the defense would have to be carried out by the American and Filipino forces already present in the islands. The primary Japanese target was anticipated to be the Philippine island of Luzon. Manila Harbor was perfect for both trade and naval shipping, and its broad plains already housed numerous military airfields. The Filipino garrison's task under WPO-3 was to guard Manila Bay's entrance and prevent the Japanese from using it until American forces arrived to relieve them. After transferring all of their supplies, tools, and ammunition to the Bataan Peninsula, they were to set up camp there right away. At first, General MacArthur disregarded this strategy and attempted to control as much of Luzon as possible, but he was unable to do so outside of Bataan and the few defended islands in Manila Bay, notably Corregidor. However, his own schedule had been thrown off due to his delay. Too much was left behind in the last-minute hurry to get troops, supplies, and equipment into Bataan. When Major General Jonathan Wainwright took over as commander of the Bataan Defense Forces West Sector on January 7, 1942, the defense of Bataan officially started. General Wainwright's Corps, which was later renamed the I Philippine Corps, shared Bataan's responsibilities with MAJI. General George M. Parker, Jr., whose two Philippine Corps occupied the fortification's eastern sector. After all the units were in place, General MacArthur told Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall in Washington, "I am on my main battle line awaiting general attack." The Japanese quickly complied and bombarded his forces with infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft attacks for the next 4 months. Insufficient supplies, especially food, caused the troops to progressively deteriorate, become ill, and lose their ability to maintain their defenses. By April, 12,000 patients were housed in inadequately staffed and equipped hospitals, many of whom were laying in the open due to a lack of space. When General MacArthur was sent to Australia to oversee the expanding American presence there, General Wainwright took over. From the fortified island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, he now oversaw all Philippine forces. The situation on Bataan was gradually getting worse. The final line of defense had been breached by the Japanese. Meiji General Edward P. King, Jr., who was now in command of Bataan, had no combat-viable battalions remaining. General King chose to surrender in order to save his troops from further casualties, even though he had been ordered to launch a counterattack. General Wainwright opposed after receiving explicit orders from MacArthur not to surrender. On April 9, 1942, King gave up the 78,000 members of the Bataan Defense Force because he had no other option. The initial Bataan battle was over. The horrifying specifics of what transpired after the capitulation are widely known. The horrific conditions of the prisoner of war camps and hell ships to Japan, as well as the Bataan Death March, are widely known. Following the capitulation of the American and Filipino forces across the islands, the Japanese continued to mostly neglect Bataan itself. Bataan had no significance to them once they had opened Manila Bay and Manila proper, both of which developed into important supply hubs for their campaigns further south and east. General MacArthur, not so much. He made his well-known statement about the Philippines as soon as he arrived in Australia. "I shall return." As soon as he was situated there, he started to arrange and plan that trip. The journey would be bloody and protracted. They fought their way up the coast of New Guinea in 1942, 1943, and early 1944, taking from the now retreating Japanese the Solomon Islands, the Admiralty Islands, Hollandia, Biak, Sansapor, and numerous other fiercely contested engagements. MacArthur was unable to fulfill his pledge until October 20, 1944, when Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th U.S. Army, which he commanded, touched down on Leyte in the central Philippines. Despite the 3 months of that brutal and challenging conflict, MacArthur was already making plans to return to Bataan and Luzon. As the military situation in the Pacific shifted, General MacArthur's plans for regaining Luzon underwent numerous revisions, but he had always intended for the main invasion force to land on the same beaches where the Japanese had attacked the island in 1941 at Lingayen Gulf. After being relieved by Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger's 8th U.S. Army on Leyte, General Kruger's 6th U.S. Army would land its XI and WW2 Corps there. General MacArthur's primary targets on Luzon, the Central Plains, and the Manila Bay area were all directly accessible from the Lingayen Gulf. Numerous more locations on the island, many of which were the same as those utilized by the Japanese, were to host subsidiary landings. As military conditions changed, not all of these would be carried out. The surprisingly strong Japanese defense of Manila was one of such shifting conditions. MacArthur anticipated that the Japanese would abandon Manila and declare it an open city, just as he had done. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the top Japanese commander in the Philippines, had intended to carry out this precise strategy, but his senior naval commander, who was his subordinate, made a different decision and fought a terrible, costly, and sad struggle for the city. The 6th U.S. Army was severely strained logistically as a result of this delay, as its supplies, equipment, and reinforcements had to cross the invasion beaches and pass through a smaller base at Nasugbu Bay that had just been taken by the 11th Airborne Division until Manila Bay became available. The eastern shore of Manila Bay had been cleared by the 1st XI Corps at the end of the battle for Manila. However, the Bataan Peninsula, which made up the western shore of the bay, would need to be occupied in order to secure Manila Harbor. Despite having just landed northwest of Bataan, Major General Charles P. Hall's XI Corps had not yet made its way onto the peninsula. General Kruger inquired about MacArthur's intentions toward Bataan. At first, MacArthur believed that General Yamashita would move his troops into Bataan and take his position there. Yamashita, however, deviated from MacArthur's intentions. His directives were to occupy American forces that might otherwise be utilized to invade Japan's home islands for as long as feasible. Yamashita viewed Bataan as a trap where his soldiers might be trapped, freeing up the majority of the American forces to pursue other goals. In order to hold out with sizable forces until the end of the war, he instead left behind delaying units and retreated gradually into the remote mountains of Luzon's interior. General MacArthur gave his staff the order to seize Bataan as quickly as possible without knowing General Yamashita's opinions on the matter, Kruger assigned the XI Corps to Bataan since his XI Corps was still primarily committed in clearing Manila and that shore. Its commander, Maji Genesee Charles Philip Hall, was born in Sardis, Mississippi, and graduated from West Point in 1911 after attending the University of Mississippi. He received a Distinguished Service Cross and multiple Silver Stars, while serving with the 2nd Division in France during World War I after being commissioned in the infantry. After being injured in combat, Hall returned and completed his education at the Army War College and the Command and General Staff School in between the wars. Brig Gen. Hall served with the 3rd Infantry Division at the start of World War II. In 1942, he was elevated to command of the XI Corps after serving briefly as the 93rd Infantry Division's commander. The 34th Infantry Regimental Combat Team from the veteran 24th Infantry Division was added to the 38th Infantry Division to form General Hall's Reconquest Corps. A strong Japanese air reply from Formosa had prompted the cancellation of the original plan to land at Vigan, 100 miles north of the Lingayen Gulf. The likelihood of a flank attack against the Lingayen beachhead was diminished by the knowledge that Filipino rebels had already seized control of a large portion of that region. Rather, XI Corps was told to land northwest of Bataan on the Zambales coast of Luzon. Any Japanese attempt to withdraw substantial forces into Bataan was to be stopped by XI Corps. Securing airfields for Allied use in the San Antonio-San Marcelino region was a secondary aim. Third, the Kembu Group, a sizable Japanese force that was still preventing 1st Infantry Corps from clearing Manila Bay, was to be struck from the right rear by XI Corps. According to intelligence sources, there were about 13,000 Japanese soldiers on Bataan. The majority of them protected the northern approaches, with about 8,000 of them located within the peninsula itself. Actually, Bataan had only 4,000 or so soldiers. These were members of the 10th Division's understrength 39th Infantry Regiment. This battalion had been sent to Leyte, but the Americans had taken control of the island before it could depart Luzon. The unit was then redirected to Bataan by General Yamashita. The 2 infantry battalions, under the command of Colonel Sanenobu Nagayoshi, were bolstered by smaller Army and Navy-based defense detachments, a platoon of light tanks, 2 temporary infantry companies, and a strengthened artillery battery. Nominally commanded by the Kembu Group, which had directed it to leave Bataan, it was known to the Japanese as the Nagayoshi Detachment. Regretfully, before Colonel Nagayoshi could leave the Bataan Peninsula, XI Corps blocked its escape route. Nagayoshi was forced to get ready for self-defense. In order to block Route 7, which ran along the base of the Bataan Peninsula, he ordered his 3rd Battalion, 39th Infantry, which included the tanks and the most of the artillery. A former American base, Olongapo, was garrisoned by 1 provisional company, while the remainder of the 2nd Battalion, 39th Infantry maintained dispersed outposts along Bataan's eastern, western, and southern shores. A company of the unit guarded San Marcelino Airfield. About 4,000 American soldiers from the XI Corps, including 5,500 Army Air Forces engineers working to repair San Marcelino Airstrip, were approaching the Japanese. On January 29th, after hearing from Filipino guerrillas that there were no Japanese forces in the region, the XI Corps landed without bombardment under the cover of 5th Army Air Force aircraft and portions of the 7th U.S. Fleet. Indeed, Filipinos cheered and waved as the first waves of assault forces arrived, and they promptly helped unload supplies. Since April 1942, the 38th Infantry Division had been headed by Major General Henry Lawrence Coulomb Jones. Born in Broken Bow, Nebraska, he had graduated from the University of Nebraska and received a command in the cavalry. Before taking command of the division, which was created from the National Guards of Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia, he had attended the Army War College, the Command and General Staff College, and the Field Artillery School. This was the division's first combat action, even though the 149th Infantry Regiment had taken part in thwarting a Japanese airborne counterattack on Leyte. General Jones gave Colonel Winfred G. Skelton's 149th Regiment the order to move inland and take control of San Marcelino Airfield, while the Filipinos assisted in unloading the supply ships. When they accomplished this, they discovered that the field was already occupied by Filipino rebels led by Captain Ramon Magsaysay. Colonel William W. Jenna's 34th Regimental Combat Team, bolstered by the reconnaissance troop of the 24th Infantry Division, likewise hurried along Route 7 to the north coast of Subic Bay. Arriving there before dark, there was no significant Japanese opposition. One enlisted man from Company F, 151st Infantry Regiment, was, in fact, the only casualty of the day. He was gored by one of the irritable Filipino carabaos. However, the Japanese were aware of the Americans' presence. Major Horonori Ogawa, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 39th Infantry, was informed by 2nd Lieutenant Hiroshi Abe, who commanded a platoon of 37mm anti-tank weapons stationed at Kalaklan Point, that he could observe roughly 40 ships trailing 2 American destroyers that seemed to be scouting Subic Bay. A reinforced 2nd Battalion of the 151st Infantry Regiment touched down on Grande Island at the entrance to Subic Bay the following day. Upon discovering that there were no Japanese occupying the area, Lieutenant-Colonel Robert Modern's forces promptly took control of Fort Wint, an American coast defense fortification from before the war. The establishment of an American base was now certain in Subic Bay. XI Corps has had an easy time thus far. The main challenge was bad beach conditions that caused some offloading to be delayed. Now, the goal was to cut off and clear Bataan before coming into direct confrontation with 64 Corps. General Hall directed the 38th Infantry Division to proceed east along Route 7, utilizing 2 regiments in mutually supporting advance lines, passing through the 34th Infantry Regimental Combat Team at Olongapo, excluding Colonel Ralph C. Paddock's 151st Infantry Regimental Combat Team held in Corps Reserve. 2 battalions of Colonel Skelton's 149th Infantry were assigned to support the main operation via a difficult track that was thought to parallel Route 7 on higher ground, while General Jones chose Colonel Robert L. Stilwell's 152nd Infantry to advance east along the road. Jones anticipated that Colonel Skelton's men would avoid any resistance along Route 7, causing the Japanese to retreat rather than be outflanked. Hall anticipated that Route 7 will be cleared by February 5th, even though Jones did not specify a timeline for the operation. The XI Corps staff appears to have mainly disregarded warnings from Filipino rebels led by Lieutenant Colonel Giles Merrill that up to 5,000 Japanese were strongly entrenched along Route 7 with machine guns, artillery, tanks, anti-tank weapons, and mortars. As it started its advance down Route 7, the 152nd Infantry estimated that there were just 900 Japanese in front of it. 3 times as many soldiers were actually dug in and prepared for the incoming Americans under Colonel Nagayoshi. With his 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Edward M. Postlethwaite, a member of the West Point class of 1937 and a native of Kansas City, Missouri, spearheaded the offensive. Without any resistance, the advance took Subic Town. Next came the attached 24th Division Reconnaissance Troop, then the 3rd Battalion in trucks, and finally the 1st Battalion, 34th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Cole, Charles E. Oglesby. The road had several twists and turns, making the terrain challenging and providing a defense with numerous ambush chances. Major Ogawa took note of this and positioned Lieutenant Abe's 2nd Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 39th Infantry for an ambush of this kind, close to Kalaklan Point. Abe positioned himself on a protruding spit of rocks next to a lighthouse, armed with 2 anti-tank weapons and 600 rounds of ammunition. Abe had several engineers under Sergeant Izu Miyake, who prepped the road for demolition, in addition to a light machine gun team led by Sergeant Tadashi Ogaki and a 2nd machine gun from the regiment's 10th Company. The Japanese were shielded from the anticipated American invasion by extensive trenches and other field fortifications. Unfortunately, the guns were positioned opposite an anticipated landing at Olongapo and, due to their deep digging, were unable to fire on Route 7. The Japanese referred to the ambush site as the Water's Edge position, with 105 mm howitzers from Lieutenant Cole, Thomas Long's 63rd Field Artillery Battalion, the 24th Division Reconnaissance Troop advanced, followed by 1st of Remion Paul J. Kane's Company, our 34th Infantry. Friendly artillery fire dropped in front of the Americans as they advanced. Colonel Long's battalion promptly received calls to cease fire, since no artillery observer had been assigned to the advance. However, Lieutenant Kane dismounted his men and dispatched 2nd Lieutenant John W. McFadden's 3rd Platoon forward to investigate, since he was unsure of whose artillery was shooting in the early stages. The Japanese started shooting as they saw the Americans getting ready to attack. The 24th Division Reconnaissance Troop, led by 1st Lieutenant Richard Vam Colopy, promptly retaliated with machine guns and anti-tank guns affixed to jeeps. Kane used his platoons to eliminate the enemy machine guns and clear a cemetery in the meantime. Kane asked for assistance as well, unsure of what they had entered into. The Regimental Cannon Company, equipped with self-propelled 75mm guns, and the 1st Platoon, 603rd Tank Company, were sent up by Colonel Postlethwaite. With the help of the Cannon Company guns, 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth E. Yeoman's 2nd Platoon managed to get past the machine guns and move in the direction of a bridge. The Japanese engineers attempted to stop the Americans by blowing a hole in the road that led to the bridge, but their attempt was unsuccessful. To the astonishment of the Japanese, who described the battle as the engineers constructing a bridge over the hole so easily that even tanks started forward on the steel plates as if nothing had happened. Engineers from Company C, 3rd Engineer Combat Battalion, a member of the combat team, hurried forward and covered the hole with steel matting. The Americans lost 3 men in the battle and 3 were injured. There were 14 Japanese fatalities. The 38th Infantry Division was to take over the offensive at this point after passing through the 34th Regimental Combat Team. As a result, on January 31st, the 149th Infantry turned left and started to follow the trail that ran parallel to Route 7, while the 152nd Infantry took the lead along the road. Despite Colonel Merrill's repeated warnings that the Japanese had dug in deep at a location along Route 7 known as Zigzag Pass, General Hall anticipated the job to be completed by February 5th. Zigzag Pass was located in rugged terrain along Route 7. For 3 miles along the road, Colonel Nagayoshi had placed his soldiers in strong positions that supported one another. Here, the path veers sharply through the pass, maybe following an animal's line of least resistance to the terrain. The area is especially dense with rainforest, so dense that a person disappears from view 5 steps off the highway. The Japanese positions were foxholes connected by trenches and tunnels. The big weaponry were kept in pillboxes made of log and earth. Every defense has a good camouflage. Ammunition for mortars and machine guns was abundant. Nagayoshi was unable to concentrate his own artillery fire because the artillery was dispersed to evade American counter-battery fire. The 152nd Infantry passed along Gapo early on January 31st and arrived at the point where Route 7 started its ascent into the mountains. Approaching Zigzag Pass, the push was only halted by long-range machine gun fire and sporadic rifle fire. The offensive persisted the next day despite growing enemy resistance. There was another issue. The path was so winding and the terrain so challenging that Colonel Stilwell and his staff had trouble finding their location on the already erroneous division and corps charts. The Americans' radios frequently malfunctioned or had limited range because of the terrain. Additionally, the 38th Infantry Division's radio code was prone to garbling, which made successful communications much more challenging. The 152nd Infantry had not yet reached Horseshoe Curve, a position that was mistakenly thought to have been reached and passed by the division and corps on February 1st. Their progress did not sit well with General Hall. The 1st Battalion, 152nd Infantry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Delbert D. Cornwell, attacked the Japanese lines early. The approach was delayed by German fire from well-hidden positions on heights overlooking the road, forcing individual platoons and companies to look for the enemy in nearly difficult terrain. Major Harold B. Mangold's 3rd Battalion was fired upon from behind as the 1st Battalion advanced into the pass. Once more, the Americans had to scatter and look for enemy positions that were cleverly concealed. During the day, not much progress was accomplished. Following dark, A squad-sized night attack was launched by a group of men personally selected by Major Owawa and led by 2nd Lieutenant Shozo Nakano of the 9th Company. A mortar, a heavy machine gun, and a light machine gun were added to each squad for reinforcement. Their only objective was to wreak havoc in the American rear by firing up artillery positions, vehicles, tents, and supply depots. Equipped with extra Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles, and a handmade fuse, they sow fear and uncertainty among the unsuspecting Americans. We dug in approximately 6 inches that night, which was our first time in the pass. PFC said, "You could hear mess kits and shovels when the first round started falling, everyone using anything to dig in deeper." Smith, Halbert of C Company. The 2nd Battalion suffered multiple casualties as a result of Lieutenant Nakano's attacks, including the death of Major Shirley N. Dewar, the executive officer. 5 men were injured, 1 man went missing, and 3 men were slain. One company of the 152nd Infantry appears to have made it to the Horseshoe Curve on Route 7 between February 1st and 2, 1945, according to post-war assessments. However, when assistance could not reach them, they were compelled to leave. The 1st Battalion spent the day attempting to locate the Japanese fortifications and determine how to approach them, as the Japanese posture was already being formally referred to as a hornet's nest. The Japanese night raids were frequent and caused fatalities in all 3 battalions. The unit lost 12 men killed, 48 wounded, and 2 missing by the morning of February 2nd. It was only the first day, too. In order to break through the enemy fortifications and go through Zigzag Pass, the regiment intended to sweep both sides of Route 7 on February 2nd. However, before this could be implemented, the 3rd Battalion, 152nd Infantry, was fired upon from an enemy position to the north that had not yet been revealed. They quickly discovered how effective these fortifications were and were unable to overcome them. The core of Colonel Nagayoshi's defenses was actually the target of the battalion's attack. Due to the Japanese digging in along a line parallel to the road, the 2nd Battalion faced virtually no resistance while the 3rd Battalion was pushed southeast. The horseshoe defenses continued to impede the 1st Battalion. Once more, the positions of the 38th Infantry Division's top battalions were reported differently at night than they were at headquarters. Although only the 1st Battalion, 152nd Infantry was at the horseshoe position, General Jones thought all 3 of his battalions were there or nearby. The regiment had suffered 5 fatalities, 26 injuries, and 1 member reported missing on February 2nd. According to the regiment, it has only been certain of killing 12 enemy soldiers in the battle thus far. Nonetheless, they had taken a Japanese map that showed Colonel Nagayoshi's defenses in their entirety. At around noon on February 2nd, General Hall had approached the unit. He was unhappy with the way the attack was being carried out and discovered that the battalions had only just started their assault. General Hall questioned one battalion commander, who acknowledged that he had only 1 patrol searching for the enemy and had no idea where they were. When asked why he had launched his attack so late, another person was unable to respond. The advancement of the 38th Infantry Division was the worst that General Hall had ever witnessed, he informed General Jones. Hall expressed his unhappiness to Jones, even though he had only seen 1 regiment of the division, and that regiment was just on its 2nd day of fighting. General Jones, who had previously led patrols in the front, was also dissatisfied, especially with the 3rd Battalion's performance. Lieutenant Jesse E. McIntosh, the regiment's executive officer, took Colonel Stilwell's post after he was relieved. The 149th Infantry Regiment's circumstances were marginally better. The unit reported itself at a position that aerial observers indicated was at least 3 miles ahead of its actual position, despite the fact that it was not heavily opposed deep in the jungles. Additionally, according to Colonel Skelton's reports, artillery fired in support of the regiment landed so far away that he could hear it but not see it. Radio communications quickly broke down. Jones had essentially stopped communicating with the regiment. General Hall also ordered up the 34th Infantry Regimental Combat Team, uncertain whether the relief would have the desired effect on the 152nd Infantry. Unusually, the XI Corps would have direct authority over the combat team rather than the 38th Infantry Division. The 34th Infantry Regiment was now to be followed by Colonel McIntosh's 152nd Infantry, which was to mop up areas of resistance that had been evaded. Hall became infuriated and informed Jones that he had more than enough soldiers to cross Zigzag Pass when he asked to utilize the division reserve, Colonel Modern's 2nd Battalion, 151st Infantry. Jones was effectively left as a regimental commander by Hall, who continued to hold the view that only a small number of Japanese manned an outpost line of resistance. On February 3rd, under mortar and artillery bombardment, Colonel Jenna's 34th Infantry Regiment advanced through the 152nd Infantry. The Horseshoe continued to defy the Americans, despite some success in the offensive. The battalions of the 152nd Infantry sent out patrols behind the 34th Infantry, knocking out multiple enemy strong posts. Although the February 4th attack performed better, the Americans had to give up a large portion of their gained land at night in order to take positions that could be defended. As a result, not much ground was actually gained. General Jones grumbled that General Hall's insistence on speed did not give him enough time to modify his artillery to make room for his troops. The Japanese would have been unaware of that. Heavy Machine Gun Company Communications. Sergeant Tomotsu Nagai visited one forward location and then returned to another. The destruction that had swept through the region since his departure astounded him. He questioned machine gunner Private Nagaharu Kobayashi about the incident. According to the explanation, American artillery responded to the gunfire with such ferocity that it destroyed all of the trees and the majority of the vegetation on the slope. Despite the 34th Infantry's stellar reputation, which included a presidential unit citation for the 1st Battalion during the Leyte campaign, the majority of the men who had served in the regiment were no longer with it. Approximately 78% of the troops who had landed with the regiment on Leyte were now missing, injured, dead, or ill, including the former regimental commander. Although it had advanced further than the 152nd Infantry, it had failed to make the breakthrough that General Hall had anticipated. Hall reattached the 34th Infantry to the 38th Division after realizing that divided command was risky in this circumstance. However, Hall was ultimately persuaded by the February 3rd onslaught that his XI Corps was up against a formidable Japanese defensive at Zigzag Pass. General Jones intended for his 152nd Infantry Regiment's battalions to launch a systematic, coordinated attack in an effort to weaken the Japanese fortifications. The Horseshoe region would be the focus and reduction of the 34th Infantry Regiment. Jones restricted artillery support to the area east of the Santa Rita River, also known as the Jajad River, due to the difficulty of directing artillery support in the jungle and terrain. As a result, it took longer to respond to demands for artillery support. Colonel Jenna took issue with his regiment being positioned in between the 152nd Infantry Regiment's battalions. Rather, he suggested that Colonel McIntosh's regiment take the north side of Route 7 and his regiment take the south. Realizing that his procedures were far slower than the rapid results General Hall was still demanding, General Jones turned down his request. Although Jones had intended to withdraw the two regiments, bombard the Japanese positions for 2 days with artillery, mortar, and air assistance, and then launch a complete two-regiment attack, he decided to go ahead with the planned attack because General Hall would not tolerate the wait. Both regiments made encouraging improvements on February 5th. However, a withdrawal was conducted once more after the Japanese artillery and mortars opened fire, killing a number of people. Colonel Jenna, who supported Jones's ideal plan, asked that the artillery bombard the enemy for a day or two before launching another attack. But Jones disregarded the proposal due to pressure from XI Corps. Colonel Jenna had suffered more battle casualties, more than 325, and non-battle losses, an additional 25, in 2 days of fighting than it had in 78 days of fighting on Leyte. Hall gave Jones the order to substitute his own 151st Infantry Regiment for the regiment, as it was no longer combat effective. On February 5th, the 1st Battalion, 152nd Infantry made significant progress, removing a Japanese-held crest. The afternoon saw a stiffening of enemy resistance, but the battalion made forward until nightfall, when it took control of Japanese fortifications that had been abandoned. However, Japanese forces with rifles and machine guns started to emerge from some of the hidden tunnels and open fire as the Americans were getting ready for the night. The Japanese and Americans were mixed together, causing confusion. The men of the 152nd Infantry were not allowed to utilize supporting fire, and they were not allowed to shoot in self-defense because doing so would have put them in danger of striking nearby friendly forces. The battalion withdrew till they came to the 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry's trenches, which was their sole option for escape. 33 men had been wounded and 9 men killed. Company B had only 1 remaining officer, and Company C had lost all of its officers. There had been no development in Zigzag Pass for 4 days by the morning of February 6th. On February 6th, there was some positive news. According to Colonel Skelton, his 149th Infantry had arrived in Dinalupihan and spoke with WW2 XI Corps. In fact, progress had been accomplished as a result of the earlier communications breakdown. Skelton had never received the orders, despite General Jones recalling him 3 times. On the other hand, Skelton had twice requested new orders from Jones, but had not heard back and had carried out his initial task. Consequently, one of Infantry's Corps' primary goals had been achieved. The Bataan Peninsula had been closed off to the Japanese. General Hall's discontent with the 38th Infantry Division, however, had gotten out of hand. He felt that General Jones's leadership was to blame. Hall went up front once more to watch operations on February 6th. He discovered no attack, but the infantry was holding off on moving forward until an airstrike and a planned artillery barrage occurred. When Jones told Hall that he anticipated the artillery fire to continue for the majority of the day, Hall gave him the order to stop the guns and move the 152nd Infantry forward. General Hall evidently made the decision that a new leader was required while he was returning. He directed General Jones to be relieved and Brig. General Roy W. Easley, the assistant division commander, temporarily took his position. Brig. General William C. Chase was transferred from the 1st Cavalry Division the following day to take over as permanent commander. The battle for Zigzag Pass was not much better after the change of command. Japanese mortar and artillery bombardment caused the same stopping progress on February 7th and 8th. However, General Chase was quickly able to use all 3 of the 38th Infantry Division's regiments, in contrast to General Jones, who was only in charge of 1. Behind the Japanese, the 149th Infantry launched an eastward push. Together, the infantry regiments of the 151st and 152nd launched an assault into the pass. Bombs and napalm were dropped on alleged Japanese positions by aircraft currently operating out of San Marcelino Airfield. Battalions of corps and division artillery were pushed up and put to great use. The Japanese, however, resisted with their customary tenacity and will, persevering for an additional week despite mounting American bombardment. The 149th Infantry and the 152nd Infantry did not unite from their respective sides of Zigzag Pass until February 15th. Nearly 2,400 Japanese officers and troops had been killed by that point. Together with Colonel Nagayoshi, the 300 survivors withdrew farther into Bataan and remained there, malnourished and under attack from Filipino insurgents. During the struggle for Zigzag Pass, the 38th Infantry Division and the 34th Regimental Combat Team suffered 1,400 losses, 250 of which were fatalities. The Bataan Peninsula still needed to be cleared by General Hall. While the 151st Regimental Combat Team cleared the west side of the peninsula, he sent the 1st Infantry Regimental Combat Team, 6th Infantry Division, led by Brig. General William Spence, artillery commander of the 38th Infantry Division along the east side. Isolated Japanese groups formed the opposition, but they were swiftly routed. Less than 1,200 troops were under Colonel Nagayoshi's command, with the majority of them located at Bagak on the West Coast Road. Despite Corregidor's weapons in the harbor, the Americans managed to make steady progress. Japanese soldiers were killed in small groups. On February 15th, General MacArthur's party pushed past the leading patrols during a visit to General Spence's headquarters. They were almost destroyed when 5th Air Force planes asked permission to bomb and attack his column because they thought they had detected a Japanese force escaping. The remainder of February saw the American soldiers evacuate Bataan, accompanied by the 149th Infantry and other units of the 38th Infantry Division. All that was discovered were stragglers and abandoned positions. XI Corps captured Manila Bay and killed 200 more Japanese at a cost of 50 killed and 100 injured. Ironically, during the initial battle for Bataan in 1942, an early Japanese breakthrough occurred on the heavily forested slopes of Mount Natib, where Colonel Nagayoshi and his surviving 1,000 troops took refuge. The majority would perish from malnutrition. Colonel Nagayoshi and the other 250 members of his initial 4,000-man group turned themselves in to American military police in a nearby village in September 1945. Following their involvement in the capture of the fortified islands in Manila Bay, the 38th Infantry Division relieved the 6th Infantry Division in the Montalban sector, where they captured Sugarloaf Hill, Woodpecker Ridge, the Shimbu Line, Mount Pinatubo, and the Wawa Dam. When the war was over, the division was told to sweep southern Luzon by June. Leyte 1944, The Soldier's Battle is the most recent book written by Nathan N. Prefer, who has written numerous books and essays about World War II. He is a former Marine Corps reservist and holds a Ph.D. in military history from the City University of New York. Dr. Prefer lives in Fort Myers, Florida, and is currently retired.